thank you again for coming and listening here, and enjoy the session. Like I said, we will have a Q&A at the end. So we'll hopefully have good discussion after Ron's presentation. So now I'm going to introduce Ron. If we can go to the next slide. So our presenter tonight is Dr. Ron Watson with Beloit College. He is an associate professor for political science and health and society. He earned his doctorate in political science from the University of New Mexico in 2013, and he joined the faculty of Beloit College that same year with a dual appointment in political science and the health and society program, where he teaches courses in areas that include the role of race in U.S. federal government and politics, U.S. health policy, comparative health systems, health inequalities, and research methods. His research interests include the politics of race and ethnicity, domestic and global health inequalities, national health care systems, and public health policy. He is co-founder of the Black Lives Matter Beloit and serves as a commissioner on the Beloit Police and Fire Commission. And so at this time, thank you, Ron. It's all yours.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's great to see so many folks. Just sort of looking at the mosaic view here, and it's great to see you all. Looking forward to having a good discussion today. I am going to just let you know that I'm going to try to move through my part of this, the sort of talk at you part of this, as quickly as possible, because I think these issues are important enough for us to spend as much time as we can discussing them and looking for at least the seeds of solutions if possible. So I'm going to try to share my screen right now. And let's see, that doesn't, nope, that did not do it. It was an email. Let me just try again. Give me just a second. Oh, I think I know what happened. I think I may have had it crash. It may have actually crashed on me while I was waiting. Let's take a look at it. There we go. So let's try this again. Can you all see this? See the slide? Probably not. Give me just a sec.
Not yet.
That should do. Okay. Yep. Not a problem. I'll get to it here in a sec. Okay. We'll share the screen. There we go. And you should be able to see that.
Yes.
I'll go ahead and hit the present. Okay. So there we are. So as I have already been so graciously introduced, my name is Ron Watson, and I teach at Beloit College. And as you can imagine, we are living in a very interesting time with respect to some of these very powerful sort of social issues that are happening, including an unprecedented global pandemic. And of course, in the middle of this pandemic, we've seen the emergence of a variety of different issues with respect to policing, including, of course, the horrific sort of daytime lynching of George Floyd out there in Minneapolis. So anyway, today, as has been said, this is my discussion. I'm going to talk about how these issues around fund diversion, and I'll get to what that means here in a second, Black Lives Matter and reparations are actually not only for me sort of radical common sense, but also potential sources of transformational policy. So my purpose, well, this is my purpose, to discuss how three seemingly radical approaches to social justice are in fact not all that radical, especially if you sort of think about it in the ways that I am proposing that we do. So let's start with the first one, which is fund diversion. So what are we talking about when we talk about fund diversion? Well, we're talking about the phrase defund the police. And I have a sort of different rationale as to why I've chosen to use fund diversion instead of defund the police. And I'll tell you a little bit of a story there. When I hear defund the police, and I think when many people hear it, and especially when I first heard it, I thought to myself, oh, wow, you're going to abolish the police department. And I think a lot of people jump to that conclusion when we talk about defund or defunding the police. And I had a situation happen maybe a couple months back where a friend of mine, when this conversation was starting to happen, who's a bit older than I am, but a colleague of mine, called me up and he said, so Ron, can you talk to me about this whole, what are people talking about? Defund the police. I mean, they want to completely get rid of police. And at that time, of course, I sort of was on the phone with him and I said, well, no, that's not really what we're talking about here, okay? We're talking about some things that you'll probably think of as very common sense approaches. And of course, as we went through the conversation, it became clearer that he more or less agreed with what I was saying. But that really sort of struck a sort of chord with me in the sense that I recognized that part of what was going on here and what may have been triggering some of the anxiety people were having was simply the language itself. We tend to think of something like defund means to sort of, completely get rid of and destroy. And there is sort of something to be said about that, right? I mean, abolition of a police department or its complete dismantlement may be the right choice for some police departments, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But at any rate, for most folks, fund diversion or defund the police really just means diverting funds from more traditional policing approaches in favor of other approaches or programs and efforts that prevent crime and problematic behaviors. So I have here written on the slide, of course, that this kind of boils down to more funding for social workers, hiring of social workers as part of police, and in some rare cases, but there is an example, and I will get to that, of the abolishment and then reestablishment of a police department as more along the lines of a Department of Public Safety. So just to give you some examples here. So Alexandria, Kentucky, for example, made the decision to hire on a social worker instead of an additional officer. Now, Alexandria, Kentucky is a pretty small town, but they believe that they have discovered something that may actually allow bigger cities to scale up. And so what did they discover? Well, they discovered that when they installed a social worker who actually works directly for the police department, okay? And that's a sort of important consideration too, based on what may be happening with your department or otherwise. What they saw was not only a drop in calls, I think to the tune of about 15%, but they saw a reduction in arrests and almost as importantly, they saw a cost savings of between $40,000 to $50,000 per year. Not a small amount of money for a small town. But Alexandria, Kentucky is not the only place that has experimented with sort of taking a different approach to traditional policing. So Eugene, Oregon, for example, we can see the CAHOOTS program. And the CAHOOTS program effectively is, and some of you out there probably have heard of it, and maybe you are even from the area and you sort of know about it, but this is sort of an extraordinary program where we have unarmed volunteers who end up being sent to about 20% of calls out there in Eugene, and particularly those that involve intoxication or some sort of mental health or emotional health issue or something related to that, right? So those folks go out and they manage to almost in every case to completely sort of defuse what's happening there. But of course, there is the extreme end of Camden, New Jersey. Camden, New Jersey, of course, many of us have heard of the city, but what a lot of people did not realize is that about 7 or 8 years ago, they made the decision to actually abolish their police department. For a small city, it had an extremely high level of violent crime, including homicide, and a variety of other issues, including an extraordinary lack of community trust. And so the decision was made for that and some other reasons, including the role that the police union was playing in keeping officers who were being accused of a variety of different issues by the community, keeping them employed. And so the seemingly, or I should say in this case, maybe clearly radical decision was made to abolish that department and didn't reestablish it. But what's interesting is that rather than completely getting rid of it, the new department made some changes, of course, but those changes ultimately ended up saving the city a great deal of money. It allowed them, somewhat ironically, especially compared to many of the arguments that I hear, right? People say you're gonna abolish it, the police is gonna be chaos, right? Well, not only did they reestablish the police department, but they were able to hire even more officers. And of course, this came with a change in mindset as well, right? In how cases are handled and the role of the community within the police department. But the, of course, biggest metric and most important one, it led to less crime, right? Substantially less crime. And so you can find some reading about Camden and what it took to have that happen. And I will say this, that there was a sort of convergence of a variety of different factors that enabled that city at that point in time to be able to change its, to make the change that it made, right, including the abolishment of its police department. And this change was supported, very interestingly, at almost every level of government, including the governor at the time, who was Chris Christie. So, what's the radical common sense here? What I would argue is that, well, fund allocation should go to where it's most effective. And this is especially the case in government, where we know that taxpayer dollars are sort of at stake when it comes to ineffective uses of funding. But what does that really mean? Well, for me, it's sort of a common sense thing. If many or even most of your calls, or even a substantial portion of the calls coming into your department can be construed as related to mental health in some way, well, why would you not utilize those who are, well, best trained for that work? That is something that for me is sort of difficult to see as controversial at all. But another part of this that's for me common sense is if you have current approaches, this sort of traditional approach to policing that doesn't seem to be working very well, then the onus is on government to figure out a way to actually change that and to improve that situation. And I have here this idea of the problem of Chicago. Some of you may know this, maybe others of you don't, but the police department, the Chicago Police Department, over a period of about 11 years, ended up costing taxpayers there over $500 million. And no, I didn't mistake million or that. I mean, over $500 million. I think the figure is something about $610 million. Ended up costing them that money because of police wrongdoing, right? So you've got over $500 million spent and really, literally nothing to show for it, especially when we consider the levels of violent crime in Chicago. And for me, I'm just constantly struck by that because I ask, what could have been done with $500 million? I mean, we can imagine so many different approaches. And, you know, in my notes here, I say, you know, everything from affordable housing and figuring out how to subsidize that to figuring out ways to improve people's mental health through the funding of programs to that in that regard, as well as job education related services and efforts. And even when something like the universal basic income, right? It could have been tried like it was in Stockton, California recently, right? So many different things that could have happened here. But, you know, for me, thinking about that loss that represents, part of the major loss that it represents is a loss in public trust. And more specifically, an opportunity that's missed, okay, to enhance versus undermine public trust. No matter how we think about it, police are agents of the states or the localities in which they are authorized to utilize force, right? And to, in many cases, utilize the state's, what we call the state's monopoly on violence. In that sense, bad police behavior, especially when it goes unpunished or is perceived to go unpunished, suggests in a very real sense that the government is actually okay with whatever actual or perceived abuse that has occurred. And that is something that, from a sort of citizen standpoint, is not something we want to have happen. We want people to feel engaged in government because that's how we get the best outcomes. So I've also said that this could lead to this sort of radical common sense, in my mind, could lead to transformational social policy. And what I mean by that is that we might see going forward policies start to emerge that that change the response rules for police and change them in ways that minimize both the loss of life and maximize the protection of life and the provision of needed assistance. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has seen too many stories about wellness checks that have turned tragic. Can scarcely imagine a worse situation, right? You ask someone to ask the police to go and check on, Mike, because you haven't heard him in a couple of weeks and you know he may be missing his medication. And then you find out on the evening news that Mike's been shot to death, right? Because he showed up at the door with, a kitchen knife or something, right? Again, sending the police, probably not the best approach there, right? And so hopefully this can lead to policies that protect lives. And of course, ultimately, as we've seen in the cases of other folks, other departments that have chosen to hire on social workers instead, that it would actually save money, not to mention lives at the end. But another sort of exciting possibility that these ideas about diverting funds from traditional policing, how this could play out, is that we could end up seeing new configurations or options for public safety. For me, again, I would argue that this opens the possibilities of locally tailored options for the merging of public health and safety. So you can see, you can imagine a hybrid department, right? And this is something that has happened in several other countries, the establishment of special emergency numbers, right? If people know that there's a sort of mental health or emotional health issue, instead of calling traditional 911, they can maybe call 311 or a different number. But there is also something that I think is very important for us to consider. And that is that this issue of fund diversion may actually allow us to start removing this sort of strange situation, right, where we have military hardware, surplus military hardware, through a variety of different national level policies, working its way down into domestic police work. And I think that we need to do all that we can to reverse that trend. And hopefully this common sense will lead to a reversal in those policies. If for nothing else, this will help to remove this sort of enemy combatant mindset, right? That some officers and some departments seem to have taken on. And while diverting the funds away, of course, from that equipment, that's designed really to fight wars. It's not designed to protect lives domestically during normal situations. So next, I'd like to move on to Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter movement. So first, let's start off with what is Black Lives Matter? Well, Black Lives Matter, quite simply, is an anti-racist movement that was launched by 3 Black queer women. This is Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors. And they launched this movement in response to the murder of Trayvon Martin, who I hope many of you remember the name, and the subsequent acquittal of his killer, George Zimmerman, who, of course, in retrospect, I think we all now, having seen how he behaves after all of this, is very much the only person there who was engaged in any criminal behavior. And the sort of resonance of the movement really sort of caught on and solidified with the subsequent protests of following the murder, of course, in Ferguson, Missouri, of Michael Brown and Eric Garner in New York. But of course, many other unarmed Black men, women, and children, including Tamir Rice, of course, that has happened nationwide since then. And typically, but not exclusively, at the hands of police. But the Black Lives Matter movement has also inspired the movement for Black Lives, as well as other movements. And the movement for Black Lives, I will say, is a coalition of more than 50 groups seeking social change to improve the lives and treatment of Black people in the US and internationally. But most importantly, I think a lot of folks, and of course, all of us have had to deal with the sort of rhetoric around this, right? You say Black Lives Matter, someone says, well, all lives matter. Or, well, you saying Black Lives Matter, that's saying that, the lives of other people don't matter. Well, we know that that isn't the case, right? And this is not a declaration of the importance of Black lives only, or Black lives at the expense of other people's lives, or the dismissal of the value of the lives of non-Black people. It is, in effect, a demand that the lives of Black people be valued and respected to the same degree as our society clearly values the lives of non-Black people, and most specifically, of course, the lives of white Americans. So what's the radical common sense around the Black Lives Matter movement? Well, here's the thing. Movements are how societies learn and how they recognize problems. At their best, what movements do, and this is all sorts of large-scale social movements, at their best, what they do is they expose areas of injustice and areas of social blindness, as well as discontent. In that way, I think of the Black Lives Matter movement in the same vein as the anti-war in Vietnam movement and various other civil rights movements across US history, including, of course, the women's suffrage movement. Of course, Black Lives Matter can also be thought of in this vein as simply the continuation of the sort of successor of the 1960s Black civil rights movement. Part of this sort of social learning piece and the social blindness aspect of this comes in that many Americans, and I'm sure many of you have heard this, right, have been shocked to learn of the disproportionate impact of police violence on Black and brown people in the United States. But also, they've been shocked about the sort of structural nature of racism, right? This is another of those terms that seems to be difficult for people to grasp, right? That there are these sort of policy-built structures that continue and perpetuate racism and racist ideas and policies. But what I would argue that this newfound knowledge among those who are usually not directly or disproportionately affected by excessive use of force by police has in turn paved the way then for policy change. But along those same lines, the Black Lives Matter movement is a natural response then to a lack of government responsiveness. In American democracy, in fact, this is what you're supposed to do. And this is why this is common sense to me, right? If you feel the government isn't being responsive, and especially if it's not being responsive in ways that are costly to you in some way, then what you're supposed to do in American democracy is join together with other individuals and groups, and you're supposed to make common cause to affect or change that policy. And that includes through protest, which is, as you all know, protected by the First Amendment. But the last piece here that turns this into common sense for me is that policy flow from these sorts of movements, including, of course, BLM, actually have wide societal benefits. I mean, if you think about the anti-war movement, it ended a destructive war in Vietnam, not only destructive to the people of Vietnam, but destructive to American lives as well. The 60s Black Civil Rights Movement, again, this culminated in laws prohibiting discrimination that have helped language minorities, right? And have led to the greater hiring and admission to a variety of different social institutions and businesses of non-Black people. Some of you probably already know that the greatest recipients, at least numerically, from affirmative action have actually been white women. And lastly on this, I'll say is that changes in policing and criminal justice, inspired in whole or in part by the BLM protest, are likely to result in more humane treatment of anyone in police encounters. And again, this is sort of tied to this issue of fund diversion as well. But that's a benefit that extends not only to Black folks who encounter police, but of course to anyone who's in a police encounter. And how is it transformational? Well, it's transformational in these ways, I would argue, that hopefully we will end up with policies from those who have been exposed and policymakers who have been exposed to this movement, policies that lead to improvements in government responsiveness. Also, we might hope that more attention will be paid to structural racism, as well as to the importance of equity and inclusion. But finally, we may end up with truly transformational social policies that that allow us to get the sort of needed policies for healing and for progress in the United States. And here I'm specifically talking about issues like reparations for slavery and Jim Crow. And so with that, I'm going to move ahead to reparations, and I put here to Black Americans. So what are reparations? So I'd like to start out talking to you about the US State Department definition of reparations. And that's this. Reparations are a key element of providing justice to victims of serious human rights abuses or atrocities. Reparation programs then focus on acknowledging the needs of victims for redress and seek to address the consequences as well as the causes of violations, both in material and symbolic ways. So this is how the US defines it, right? And we can talk a little bit more then about what reparations are. But for me, I argue that reparations really are not about trying to fix the past or to make up for the past. I think that if we go that route and we say, well, you can't go back in time and change something that's already happened, that's obviously true, right? But reparations really aren't about that. I mean, what's happened has happened. I mean, how can you, I mean, I often think, how can you actually make up for some of the horrific things that we've seen through American history? I mean, what's the reparations for, what's the payback for a slave market or for using children as, gator bait and those sorts of things? Some of the most horrific things that one can imagine. Reparations really are about attempting, as it says in the name, to repair the present, right? You repair the present so that you can then move forward into the future, right? And what are you repairing? You're repairing those sort of legacy effects, the lingering effects of the past and the wrongdoing of the past. Some of you may know that reparations, and probably maybe in school you've even learned about this, reparations. Reparations, of course, have a long history in the international system, going back obviously before World War I, but World War I, I think, becomes one of the biggest examples or best known examples of reparations in this context. But what a lot of folks I'm sort of surprised to know don't realize is that Haiti as well, a sort of lesser known example, Haiti, the little country, the very poor country, was forced to pay reparations to France. Yes, that very rich country, France, because of its independence, right? Which effectively is a slave revolt, which you all know, right? Haiti has the first and certainly the biggest successful and most successful slave revolt in world history. And so, but there is plenty of evidence suggesting that push by France and others to demand that Haiti pay restitution to France actually impacted deeply that country well into the 20th century. But reparations have also happened in the United States. But the only clear example we have of both symbolic, which I think you'll be able to get from how I talk about this, symbolic and monetary reparations, is the example, of course, that happened in the 1980s, in which Japanese American survivors of the sort of racist policy of forfeiture and property and forfeiture of property, and forced internment during the 1940s. They were provided $20,000, those survivors were provided $20,000 each, and were given an official apology, right? An official federal apology that was signed by then President Ronald Reagan. And later on, we can talk about why that happened for Japanese Americans, because I think there's some very important reasons for us to discuss as to what led to that. So you would think in the case of if reparations could be paid in the case of the Japanese Americans who were interned, and I think that period lasted for about 4 years. And this is not to downplay that at all. I mean, you can scarcely imagine a more terrifying thing, right? That you suddenly are told, oh, you're an enemy of the state. I know you were born here, but sorry, you're gonna have to give up everything and go live somewhere else now. And if you leave, we'll harm you. That despite that, which is obviously a clear-cut case for reparations, the other clear-cut case for reparations that we're talking about here is in the case of African Americans, right? Black Americans. But in their case, attempts to pass legislation to create even a committee that would simply study the impact of slavery and Jim Crow has never passed in Congress. And it hasn't done so despite decades of effort. Some of you remember Representative John Conyers, of course, spent over 30 years introducing this bill in Congress to just study the impact of these horrific crimes against humanity. But never passed. It didn't matter whether Republicans or Democrats were in control of the House. And of course, you know, sort of the last thing to say here is, while there have, of course, been no reparations in that sense at the national level for African Americans, there haven't been any for American Indians either. So what's the radical common sense here? Apologies and making amends, they are normal for wrongdoing. And what I say here is, you know, if you think about it, reparations are really a sort of collective version of what decent people try to teach their children all the time, which is, if you make a mistake, you apologize. And if you make a bad mistake, you make amends when you've done something wrong. That's supposed to be common sense, right? But I go a little bit further here, because what I would argue is monetary reparations, which has always been the sticking point for many people, you know, it would just cost too much, right? It would bankrupt the country. I think when I first started paying attention to this idea of reparations in the 90s, there was a group back then, I think, called NCOBRA, and they had developed a what they said would be about a $8 trillion reparations package. And back then people were like, oh, that's, you know, it doesn't make any sense. That couldn't possibly occur. But as we've seen, this isn't really the case. The US economy is more than adequate to handle $8 trillion. And the reason why I say that is because my own calculations, I have, of course, developed my own schema for reparations. It would cost about as much as the latest stimulus package did, about $2 trillion. And that would be less than the publicly known figure of what has been spent by the United States in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and that's about $4 trillion. Most experts agree that that number is probably closer, though, to about $8 trillion. So there's that, right? So clearly the U.S. has not been bankrupted by this. But if you go back to this idea of seeing this reparations, monetary reparations, and keep in mind that reparations can consist of multiple types of reparations. But monetary reparations in this sense would have a similar effect to the stimulus package we've seen. We see a boost in domestic consumption, which would, of course, boost the economy for everyone. And most of that money, if not almost all of it, would be spent within the United States. And you contrast that to what we see with the ultra wealthy and the tax breaks that they get. Many of those individuals then take steps to move their money outside the United States to bank accounts that can't then be touched for taxation purposes. So ultimately don't benefit anyone except themselves. But another common sense piece here is that even if you think, well, monetary reparations are out of the question, Ron, I mean, that's not a thing. We can't do that, right? It's just, we spent too much money already. Okay, then my question is, well, what about symbolic reparations? They don't really cost anything, or they cost very little monetarily. And symbolic reparations, what I mean by this, just some examples are changes in political representation. We could change the way that we choose to do representation, both in Congress and in this, and both houses of Congress and elsewhere. We could change the national anthem. We could change the flag. South Africa has, of course, done both in the post-apartheid phase of the country, right? We could do things like a federal official recognition of Juneteenth as a national holiday. We could have, and this is one of my personal favorites, the conversion of these presidential holidays like Lincoln's birthday or someone else's birthday or President's Day. You could actually convert those into a day or days of atonement for a variety of different groups to recognize what's happened in the past. And of course, the removal and replacement of statues and public art are other examples that we would see here that aren't very costly, but are deeply meaningful. And we've seen examples of this in Germany, right, with the public art projects that don't allow the public to forget what happened in the Holocaust. And lastly, here I argue that restorative reparations, and let me just give you a quick definition of that. Restorative reparations, I say, are reparations that are aimed directly at eliminating disparities in health, wealth, and well-being. But I argue that these sorts of reparations can really be seen as an investment in your people, right? And one that will, in fact, deliver society-wide returns going forward. And there are any number of examples of this, right? I mean, imagine what would happen with the economic impact, right? The sort of positive economic impact of providing tax credits or subsidies. And the need for many people to have therapy and to have those sorts of services. And of course, healthcare, since we know that African Americans disproportionately suffer from almost every ailment vis-a-vis their white counterparts, including hypertension, and other cardiovascular disease. Imagine the societal benefits of having a healthier African American population. Again, everyone would benefit. And in that sense, restorative reparations enhance multiple dimensions of American life. So what makes it transformational in terms of social policy? Well, we hope that that common sense will lead to, frankly, a more equitable reallocation of financial, educational, and political resources. One that would take into account what people actually need and the equity of providing it to them, rather than we have seen to date. We would also see massive reductions in poverty and its attendant ills. As I think most of you know, middle income folks who are well educated and are in good places in their lives and are healthy, they tend not to do things like drive-by shootings. So just taking that piece in and of itself, we should be able to recognize that if we eliminate poverty, we will almost by extension eliminate its ills. But this could also lead, especially reparations, and if done properly, could lead to the sort of national reconciliation and identity building that people like me have wanted the country to move to for as long as I can remember. Not a country where all of these different identities exist and people are, of this mindset that, well, I'm actually this sort of hyphenated American and this sort of person, or I'm a part of a group that has been completely marginalized throughout the entire history of this country. But really, for the first time, actual national reconciliation and identity building common identity as Americans, truly as Americans, not simply as part of a group that of an identity that's defined primarily by others. And this is sort of hints at, this particular point does hint at the last point I make here, is the sort of untold psychological and emotional benefits that are likely to come from handling reparations and dealing with the past and the legacy effects of that past in a very intense and meaningful way. When I think about everything from the ways in which many people carry around guilt once they learn about what the country has done in the past and how it came about, everything from that to the animosity that we see between so many different groups. I mean, what would it be like to live in a country, to live in a United States that had actually dealt with those problems and dealt with them effectively and humanely and in a way that brought people together rather than divided them? It almost sort of boggles the mind. So, just want to move now to my conclusion. I've talked pretty quickly here, and I hope that we can return to some questions and really get further into this. But what I would say is that the current nationwide turmoil is as clear an indicator as any that much work lies ahead in creating the kind of society that serves the interests not only of a particular segment of its people, but really of everyone. The failure on both sides of the political aisle. And again, I don't sort of walk away from this. I can go back to Conyers' attempt over 30 years, right, of trying to get just the study done of the effects that slavery and Jim Crow have had on the United States, in particular on Black Americans. But both sides of the aisles have failed here, right? And it turns out that their failure to take decisive action to acknowledge and redress what we now call crimes against humanity, right? That did not, in fact, make the situation better. In failing to do anything at all, it's only sort of kicked the can forward into a situation where we are now, of course, face to face with the consequences of that. So what I argue is that fund diversion with respect to police, the Black Lives Matter movement, and reparations to address the legacies of the crimes of slavery and legal segregation may seem on their face to some people as somewhat sort of radical solutions. But what I hope I've shown, and I know I've gone sort of quickly here, is that by and large, these concepts are nothing more than common sense approaches to confronting and moving forward from the painful and brutal legacy that the founders of this country and successive generations, unfortunately, have unfairly left to us. So with that, I will stop and say thank you all for listening, and definitely want to get into our questions. And I reference list, and I started to put the references in this file and realized it was going to end up being about 4 different slides, and that'd be sort of ridiculous. So those are available upon request as a separate PDF. So I'm going to stop sharing here. Okay, and I would like to open things up for some questions if we can.
Thank you, Ron. That was excellent. And thank you to those who have started to ask questions. So the first question is, can you briefly describe the transition from traditional police departments to more effective departments like the Camden, New Jersey, stages, time needed, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, so as I said, I think I sort of intimated, is that the Camden case is a very interesting case, right? To look at from a policy standpoint. But I think they will be the first folks to tell you that this required the coming together of a variety of different sort of political and social issues, right? I think the timeline, if you read over it, I think the timeline of that was in some ways cooking up for over a decade, right? There was at least about a 10-year period of people recognizing something is not right here, and we were unable to get folks out of the department that we needed to get out, and a variety of other things. A variety of other problems. But when the decision was made, I think, to abolish the department, I think it was something along the lines of, we're abolishing it today, and then, next week we are adding it, creating the new department, right? So there wasn't this sort of massive gap, and there's no police force or anything like that, right, in place. But the folks spent, I think, about a year or so, if I'm remembering correctly, about a year, maybe 2 years, really sort of hammering out what this would look like. And of course, the role of activists who had been talking about defunding the police is actually critical there, right? Because they had these ideas in place that they could sort of readily say, here's what we're talking about. And policymakers were then able to vet those and say, okay, I think that's reasonable given the circumstances. So, it wasn't overnight, but it certainly was not a situation. I think this may be part of the concern, right? That ended up with no police department for like 3 years. That wasn't how it happened at all. But yeah, there are any number of sources you can find to talk about that, about Camden. And so I strongly encourage you to go out and find some of those, right? There's a political piece that I think I have in my reference list that might be a good place to start.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
And I should say, after this Q&A, for people who are still on the line, we have some action items that you guys can do, and also talk about our next program. So please stay on. Our next question is, was a comment. The NAACP was formed in 1919 as a response to lynching and the need to end this in America. Unfortunately, we still have work. Then, were reparations made in any way in South Africa after the end of apartheid?
So the way that the situation happened in South Africa was a decision was made to, we wouldn't say reparations in the way that we're talking about it right now, but they decided as a society to create the Truth and Reconciliation, I want to say committee, but sort of tribunal that would allow people to sort of vet what had happened and to look for answers from the sort of largely white government at that time. And so that was an important part of their national reconciliation work. And I think I mentioned about this decision to change the flag and the decision to change the national anthem. Again, these were I wouldn't call them reparations per se, but they were certainly attempts to, in the wake of this horrific system of apartheid. These were attempts to create the sort of national nation building and sort of identity building that are critical in that sort of post-conflict scenario. And so, but, you know, there probably is the case that some individuals were paid some restitution for what happened. What I also think happened in South Africa, as I sort of recall back to my colleagues who were from there, as we had some discussions about this in the past, was that it was understood that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was their way of saying we're not going to hold anyone responsible because we can't move forward as a society unless we sort of figure out why people committed these crimes. And if you tell people you're going to punish them, then they're not going to come forward. I mean, this is a case in which we had many people who had gone missing, right? Who had gone into police custody and were never seen again. And so people just wanted answers. Now, of course, in the post-commission era, there have been attempts by a number of individuals to try to gain more restitution from this.
Thank you. There's a question about to pay reparations to France. Did that almost destroy the Haitian economy?
I mean, I think that's the absolute implication, right? I mean, France isn't asking for reparations because, a couple of plantations were destroyed, right? I mean, the idea here is a clear attempt to destroy, right? I mean, it's a slave revolt in the 1700s, right? The late 1700s. So, this is something that that for the French at the time is seen as, a sort of punch in their eye, right? How dare these slaves think that they can do this, right? And that's really the clear implication. It was really an attempt to stymie and destroy Haiti. And from a financial standpoint, there's little question that it did. It is in terms of national level and international level policy, because France, of course, was not alone in enforcing this. And of course, the United States, again, had a role here as well, because of course the United States did not want the people that it was enslaving to get any bright ideas from Haiti, right? And so you end up with a situation where the Haitian government and the Haitian people are hampered for well over nearly 2 centuries because of this.
Okay, regarding statues of Confederate heroes or statues, what suggestions do you have for where they could be stored as part of our history? While many of us don't want to honor them, do you think they should be destroyed or placed in some type of museum or something else?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question and an interesting point. So I'll probably spend a little time on this. So I'm from Virginia, from Central Virginia, and just so you know, I mean, I'm from where the founders are from, right? Like I'm that guy, right? Like Thomas Jefferson was, his house is down the street, right? That sort of thing. And some of his Black relatives also were down the street, right? Where I'm from. And so you have to understand that there are 2 points here for me. And I also am I'm a student of history. I love history, I always have. I understand the concern about the sort of whitewashing isn't really the term, but the erasure of history, right? If you take you're erasing this history. But what a lot of people don't realize is that most of these statues only came about in the 20th century. They haven't been around for, since time immemorial. And they were created through a very specific set of policies that ran through especially Southern states, but not simply Southern states, that were literally intended to reinforce white supremacy. So I guess, on some level, what I'm arguing here is that those statues don't really have any deep historic merit to me, right? It's not like they were, created by these extraordinary artists who were, their work is going to be lost forever. I mean, these aren't, works of Michelangelo or that sort of thing, right? These are works that were created in this very specific way for a very specific purpose. Now, what I think should happen, if you put me in charge of it, I would say, okay, we either remove those and ensure that our textbooks talk a great deal about those folks and what it is that they stood for, and what they really stood for, not just, that they were heroically fought in some battle, but that these folks would, how can I say this, that you'd either do that, Or you would do something that Banksy, do you all know who Banksy is? The street, or the sort of really famous artist now, right? The street artist, he's always doing these pranks. Like one of his works sold for, I think, like $4 million. And when the person at Sotheby's or whatever hit the gavel, all of a sudden it automatically shredded itself, right? He's that guy, right? So, much to the chagrin of the people who bought it, right? But his idea is actually a brilliant one. He said, no, leave the statues there. Well, I'm assuming his, right? We don't actually know Bansky's sex, but Bansky said, leave the statues as is, but just add a statue around it that shows people pulling it down, which I thought was brilliant, and have a plaque that says why they want to pull it down. That's another really, really cool way to go about this. And there was I think, what did I say, the mayor of Richmond, Virginia, he had a similar sort of idea. It was like, no, let's leave them up, but let's put plaques that actually talk about who these people are and what these statues are about. At the end of the day, I think that the presence of these statues and especially the sort of anger around them, right? Like, how dare you remove these statues, really misses the point of why they were created. And I would say, rather than celebrate them, and if it hurts people as much as it clearly does, let's remove them, right? Because keep in mind that their continued presence not only hurts people like myself, right, who had to grow up around that my whole life, right? Not only does it hurt them, but it also emboldens the people who already want to continue to believe that, well, this is a part of a great heritage. Well, I mean, if you see the word great in sort of great and terrible sense, yes, I suppose so. But at the end of the day, they're just statues, and given the reason why most of them came about, they're not really things that I would seek to preserve as is in any way. And I don't think they need to be saved or kept anywhere except by collectors in their own private homes, right? So that would be my default position on it.
Thank you.
Sure.
So a comment. There's another argument to why reparations wouldn't be a good idea now. How would you reply to that?
Well, I'd ask what's the argument? I would say, what's the argument? I'd want to know what the argument is why it wouldn't be a good idea now. I mean, they haven't been a good idea for most people for most of the country's history, right? So, in that sense, now doesn't seem to be any different from me than 150 years ago or 10 years ago or 3 years ago, right? It's oftentimes, and I would actually argue there's often in these instances of extreme social upheaval, okay, that we can see important policies go forward. I was talking to someone about this when we think about women's suffrage. The women's suffrage movement, women's suffrage happens around the time of the First World War, right? So we're not talking about everything was sort of hunky-dory and everything was like, oh, okay, everything is fine. It's like, no, we finally get women's suffrage, at a time when there was massive social upheaval. Similarly with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, these pieces of policy don't about without the upheaval of the Black Civil Rights Movement, right? So upheaval, as it turns out, is sort of the right time because it tosses all of the cookies up in the air, right? All of the pieces go up in the air, and it's like, okay, now is the time to try to redefine how we want to be and what we want to do. So, yeah, I mean, maybe not today. We don't have to do reparations like literally today. But yeah, I mean, I think putting a plan in place for the next 3-4 years definitely makes some sense all the time.
Thank you. And I guess we just have a couple more minutes. So I don't know if we're going to be able to answer all of these questions. I often see funding of social workers pushed as an alternative to traditional policing. Anecdotal experience with social workers includes examples of white saviorism and mistrust. How do we prevent social work from being just another problematic system and build a program that truly reflects the desires of the people it claims?
Well, I think that you put your finger right on it at the end, right? Is that we need to then be training. If we look at our community and we make the decision in our community to do this, right, then we need to be training those social workers or hiring on social workers who have their fingers on the pulse of the community in the way that you're talking about. if you're a small community like Alexandria, Kentucky, right? The person they hired on is probably from around there, sort of knows the situation. And I too know many, unfortunately, many circumstances in which caseworkers have been sort of overworked and haven't been able to deliver the kind of service that we would want. But that being said, that's a sort of different category of social work that's happening. That's not the same as social work specifically for police and policing, right? And there are plenty of examples. Again, I very much understand the concern there, but this isn't sort of general social work, right? This is social work for a very specific set of calls. Do we have time maybe for at least one more? Sorry about that. I hope that answered the question.
Yes. Do you believe fund diversion could be possible within our communities?
I think it depends on your community. I absolutely think it's possible because I have to, right? We still do live in a democracy. And I know the importance of policy. And I'm a political scientist. So if I said policy doesn't work, that they probably take my political science badge away. But yeah, I think policy is important and policy can work. But it will depend, of course, on the type of community that you live in. And in some communities, fund diversion maybe isn't as necessary, right? I mean, if you've got a department that already has a number of like highly trained officers that doesn't shoot people at the drop of a hat, where the community and the police department have great communication and relations, and I mean the whole community, not just a portion of the community, then of course fund diversion doesn't really make a lot of sense in that context, right? Like diverting to what? We're doing fine. But when I think about departments that have tanks and these other sort of literal weapons of mass destruction in order to deal with what? Robberies, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think it behooves everyone to look at their community and policing in their community and ask if that sort of use of funds is actually an effective one.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, so we have one more slide just to show the next steps that you are all invited to consider doing in your life. While that's coming up, the September DAT program is going to be on the 17th at 6:30. It's going to be working together when COVID-19 and racial disparities meet. Another great topic. So it'll be by Zoom. You can register the same way you did for this one. And the flyers will be out soon. So look for that. And again, this recording and the resources, there will be links on the DAT website. The video will be on the Hedberg Public Library website, and Ron, I'm sure we'll be getting your references, and we'll post those on the DAT website. So we'd like to leave these programs with steps that you individually can take to move forward. And so the first one, self-educate, how to be an anti-racist. The League of Women Voters Janesville Book Club discussion is going to be on that book on next week, same time, 6:30, and you can sign up online through the League of Women Voters, or read it on your own, or listen to it. To listen, be willing to hear the experiences, worldviews, aspirations, and fears of those whose lives have been most clearly impacted by racist policies and ideas. And we shared a few podcasts that you can listen to as well. Again, this will be on the website as well, so you can have those links there. 3, practice conscious consumerism. Vigorously support companies and organizations that unequivocally denounce racism and support anti-racism. 4, courageous conversations. Not only the actual scheduled programs, which are the 4th Mondays at 5:30 on Zoom, but also speak up when friends, family, and colleagues express racist ideas or promote racist policies. And 5, take action. Vote out and protest against politicians who support racist policies, empower and embolden advocates of anti-racist policies. And with that, Ron, a sincere thank you for a wonderful presentation tonight. Thank you to our co-sponsors, the YWCA, the NAACP, Beloit chapter, Community Action, and Hedberg Public Library. Thank you, and have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.